Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into the kind of moments that leave you frozen. The ones where someone says or does something so off, you suddenly realize you're not just dealing with someone weird, you're dealing with a full-blown psychopath. These are the true stories of people who had that chilling "oh shit" moment when they saw the mask slip and everything changed. Before we begin, I want to share something close to my heart. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and any support you can give means the world to me. The GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's get into these unsettling encounters. Story 1. I've been a public school teacher for a decade. I've only ever been truly scared of one student. This happened during my first few years of teaching at an alternative school for students who had been expelled from every other school. Despite their reputations, most of the students were surprisingly chill. They weren't great at academics, sure, but if you met them at their level, things were usually fine. The exception was JT. JT was already a kind of myth when I started. He was a sophomore at the time, and though I didn't teach him yet, I heard about him constantly. Somehow, his mother had managed to manipulate the education system so well that JT was essentially unpunishable. He was protected by layers of 504 plans and IEP paperwork. He once pushed an 8-month pregnant teacher down and was back in school 2 weeks later. He could punch another kid in the mouth and only miss a couple of days. The system couldn't touch him, and he knew it. What really unsettled me was hearing that his own mother was afraid of him. She was vocal about not wanting him at home, and with good reason. As a child, JT had attempted to murder his family by lighting their house on fire. He had duct-taped his brother to a bed before starting the fire. His brother survived, but with horrific burns. Even more disturbing, his brother still supported JT despite everything. JT was cruel and calculating, but small, about 5'4". His brother, meanwhile, was about 6 feet tall and much stronger. By the time I finally had JT as a student, he was a senior. He had about 10 credits to his name, almost all gym-related, and he was nowhere near graduation. What struck me most was that this was the only student I've ever met who seemed to have absolutely nothing behind his eyes. He was shark-like. He never smiled or laughed, unless someone got hurt. He was cruel for cruelty's sake. One day, JT didn't show up to school. That was unusual. He had a solid little drug business going, and usually only avoided the one cop assigned to the school. The next day, we found out why he hadn't been there. JT had murdered a kid. He shot him in the face over $12 and a small amount of weed. His lawyer tried to argue that it should count as a first offense, since all his previous violence had happened when he was still a minor. But it didn't matter. He was sentenced to 25 to life. And honestly, I wasn't surprised. Story 2. A kid I went to primary school with once invited me to his house after school. Not many people really talked to him. This was a private school, and he was only there because his dad worked as a groundskeeper. I didn't really want to go, but I also didn't want to be a jerk like everyone else, so I said yes, but told him I couldn't stay long. We went behind his house, and I noticed several bare patches in the grass. Some had a single stick poking out of the middle, while others had thin plastic tubes sticking out. He was visibly excited as he started digging at one of the spots with a hose coming out of it. After a moment, he pulled up a jar with a dead baby bird inside. The hose had been threaded through a hole in the lid, apparently to let air in. Then he casually told me that he liked burying things alive. Sometimes, he said, he'd seal the jar completely. Other times, he'd give the animals an air hose, and even put in a little food and water to keep them alive longer. He said you couldn't bury them too deep, or you wouldn't hear them trying to escape. Occasionally, if he was bored, he'd pour water down the tubes to drown them. I was only 8 or 10 years old at the time, and even then, it made me feel sick. I'm 52 now, and I still can't forget it. Thinking about it even today still makes my stomach turn. Story 3. After moving to a new city a few years ago, my best friend came to visit. We're both 30-something dudes. One night we were out at a bar when a guy asked to sit with us because there weren't any free tables outside. We said fine. Being polite, we started talking to him. He told us he was a truck driver just stopping overnight in town, and at some point he mentioned he was From there, things began to get strange, but slowly, like the proverbial frog in water being brought to a boil. Not only was he in the military, but he had a brother, maybe a twin, I can't recall, who was in the CIA, embedded in Russia. My friend and I also gradually got the sense that this guy was a little too interested in us. Eventually, we closed our tabs and decided to go to a different bar, but the guy stuck with us, telling increasingly tall tales about his time in the military. He eventually confessed there was no brother. He was the spy who'd been embedded in Russia. What struck me was how, even though his stories got more and more ridiculous, his demeanor was deadly serious. The intensity was starting to make my skin crawl. He started picking fights with other people at the bar, deliberately being belligerent. Over time, he began to radiate this menacing air that hadn't been apparent when we first met him. He never got directly angry at us, but it felt like he was showing us how scary he could be, and hinting that we should stay on his good side. Finally, he took me aside and slipped into a not very convincing Russian accent. He said he was never a spy for the US. He was a double agent, a one-man Russian sleeper cell. But he couldn't bear lying to me. He had to come clean. Even though we had open tabs at the bar, my friend and I waited until the guy went to the bathroom, abandoned our cards, and left immediately. Story 4. I'll name this friend of mine Jim. Jim's girlfriend and I worked at the same job. We also had a co-worker there who happened to share my first name. At some point, Jim's girlfriend started an affair with that co-worker. One night, Jim saw a sexually explicit text pop up on her phone. The message looked like it came from me. He dug deeper into her phone and found a full thread of messages filled with infidelity. Things like, "Can't wait to see you at work tomorrow." Jim knew she and I worked together, but he didn't know there was another guy with the same name as me. So naturally, this looked unbelievably bad from his perspective. Out of nowhere, my phone started blowing up with calls and texts from our entire friend group. People were furious, asking what the hell my problem was, and why I would stab Jim in the back like that. I was completely confused. Then, Jim sent me a really angry and deeply personal text, and blocked me immediately after. This all happened around midnight, and since I didn't have his girlfriend's number, there was nothing I could do to clear things up. The next day, I went into work and saw her talking to the guy she was actually cheating with, my named twin. I walked right up and said bluntly, "Why does Jim think I'm fucking you?" The other guy looked completely confused and turned to her. And right then, everything clicked. Until that moment, I had no idea it was him. He didn't know she had a boyfriend, and she didn't realize Jim had found out yet. The shock hit her all at once, and she started freaking out. Long story short, we got everything cleared up. I had my co-worker come talk to Jim and explain what really happened. He apologized to Jim, reassured him that I had nothing to do with it, and took full responsibility. Thankfully, Jim and I patched things up, and our friendship is back to normal. But that was one hell of a stressful 36 hours. I honestly thought I was going to lose all my friends because his girlfriend cheated with someone who just happened to have the same name as me. And before anyone asks, no, Jim didn't double-check the number in her phone. He told me he basically shut down emotionally. All he saw was my name attached to nudes and dirty messages about seeing each other at work. He said he just made the connection instantly and couldn't think straight. I don't blame him, given the circumstances. I completely understand why he reacted the way he did. Story 5. I-20F was dating this guy 23 meters for a few months, and things were going really well. Then, around the same time, we both had to move for our jobs. He wanted to try a long distance, so we did. We called most days, watched movies together during our off time, and tried to keep things feeling normal. The time zones made it a little tricky, but it wasn't too bad. Then out of nowhere, he tells me he doesn't want to be together anymore. I was definitely blindsided, but I said okay. It hurt, but I started getting on with my life, hanging out with friends, doing the usual post-breakup routine. About a month later, he absolutely begs to get back together. I'm talking movie-level effort, sending flowers to my job, mailing handwritten cards nearly every day across thousands of miles, and even buying me a plane ticket to visit him. Eventually, I agreed to go see what he had to say. Worst case, I'd just fly home early. I booked a return flight 2 days later, just in case. When I got there, he picked me up from the airport and acted like his old self, telling me how much he missed me. That breaking up was the biggest mistake of his life, and so on. He asked me to stay at his family's house instead of a hotel, because he already felt so guilty. I figured, free place to stay, why not? The first few days were fine. Then I got an alert on my phone, a hurricane warning. My flight was pushed back for days. I only took 3 days off work, so I was already stressed. When I told him about it, he said, "Oh, I know. We already started boarding up the windows." That creeped me out a little, but I figured that's just what people do during big storms. The next morning, he wakes me up and tells me to come to the living room. Still half asleep, I follow him in and find him, his parents, his 2 brothers, and his sister all sitting there. People I've only met this one time. He's holding a binder. They sit me down, and each family member takes turns reading a passage from the binder about why he and I shouldn't be together and why I need to move on. Then he breaks up with me in front of his whole family during a hurricane in a power outage. And because of the storm, I was stuck in that house with them for 4 more days. Probably not the most psychopathic person I've met, but still one of the weirdest and most bizarre things that's ever happened to me. Story 6. At a party once, I met a friend of a friend who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. She was the kind of person who sighed dramatically and used the unique stresses of her job to draw attention to herself. She seemed to relish the spotlight, and when she got it, she began talking at length about how difficult her job was. When I asked if there were parts of the job she actually enjoyed, her face lit up. She said she worked primarily in maternity. I expected some sweet or heartwarming stories, but instead, her anecdotes had little to do with mothers or infants. What she really focused on was how much she loved being in charge of these women's lives. She described how fragile the patients were in those moments, and how, according to her, even hours after delivery, she was the only one on the floor who could predict life-altering complications. She absolutely glowed as she talked about having their lives in her hands. It wasn't compassion, it was power that thrilled her. Eventually, the conversation shifted to other topics, as party conversations do, but she found her way back into the spotlight. When the topic of high school came up, she told a story about how she'd been rejected for an advanced choir position back in the day. Then she added, almost smugly, that years later she got to sing at the instructor's funeral. I'll never forget the pride she took in having control over other people's lives. It struck me as one of the most basic and chilling displays of quiet evil I've ever seen. Story 7. My ex once told me that if I ever got pregnant with a girl before a boy, he would push me down the stairs to make me miscarry, as many times as it took, so we could have a boy first. We broke up not long after that, but later he convinced me to talk things over with him. I got into his car, thinking maybe it would be a civil conversation. Instead, He began calmly explaining that it didn't matter if I took him back or not, as he headed straight for the expressway. I asked him where we were going, but he stayed completely silent. As the speed increased, his tone never changed. Finally, he began talking, still calm, still flat, about how we would be together forever, no matter who tried to pull us apart, no matter if I saw it yet or not. I asked again where we were going, and with a creepy smile, one I still remember vividly. He told me we were heading to a neighboring state, where no one would know or find us. I had to call my mother in the middle of it. She got on the phone and begged him to bring me back home. And as if that wasn't terrifying enough, after I got home and refused to see him again, he started standing outside my family's house through all hours of the night. He called me and sang songs over the phone, threatening to burn my house down and kill everyone inside if I didn't come outside and talk to him. Story 8. She showed up late to our date, immediately ordered a drink and a burger, and told me she was running behind because of a family thing. No big deal, I figured that kind of stuff happens. Before her burger even arrived, she casually mentioned that she'd have to cut the date short because she had a family dinner. I said, okay, all good, assuming this would be a short, simple meet. Then she launched into this story about how her sister had met a guy on Tinder, brought him to a family barbecue, and they ended up getting married. Wild, right? Without missing a beat, she followed it up with, wouldn't it be funny to pull a prank on my family? Like, you and me went to my family barbecue and let everyone assume we were really hitting it off, and they'd totally think we were gonna get married. Now, I'll admit, I'm probably also the psychopath in this story, because I went. The mashed potatoes were good. She spent the entire night introducing me as her future. And yeah, I had to take a little Tinder break after that. Story 9. When I was a kid, I had a friend whose mum rented out the house connected to theirs. The man who lived there kept to himself, but he always seemed nice enough. If he saw me or my friend, he'd sometimes let us pet his bird, which he always seemed to have with him. It was just this quiet, odd man, but nothing that ever raised alarm. Eventually, he stopped paying rent and was kicked out. The mom who owned the property never checked in on the place while he lived there. So when he was gone, she had no idea what condition it was in. I offered to help her clean it out, mostly because I just wanted to hang out with my friend while she helped her mom. She unlocked the door and said she'd be right back after grabbing some cleaning supplies. I stepped inside to take a quick look around before she returned. What I saw was something I'll never forget. There were dead rats everywhere, some in traps, others with their heads cut off. Blood was smeared across the floors and even on the walls. I think there was peanut butter, too, smudged in strange patterns alongside the blood. I stood there, frozen, horrified. And for some reason I still can't explain, I kept walking through the house. Every room was worse. More dead rats, trash, broken objects. The bathtub was filled with rat corpses. It was like something out of a nightmare. But the part that truly stuck with me, the part I can still see clearly in my mind, I opened a closet, and there was his bird. The same bird he'd always carried, now stripped of all its feathers, hanging from a string, clearly dead. I broke down and ran out of the house, crying. For a long time after that, I lived in fear. I kept thinking maybe he knew I saw his secret. Maybe he knew where I lived. Maybe he'd come for me. It still gives me chills. Story 10. I met this guy through a buddy, and everyone called him Ranger Dave. He was supposedly a former Army Ranger, multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, decorated with heroic medals, and generally came off as a super nice, all-around good guy. I only knew him in passing. I'd see him driving through town, run into him at the grocery store, or bump into him at the coffee shop. He lived locally, and by all appearances, he seemed totally normal. One day, I was walking home from the lab when Ranger Dave pulled up and offered me a ride. He already knew where I lived, He'd been over a few times for pre-games and casual hangouts, so I said sure and hopped in. As we were driving, we came to an uncontrolled four-way intersection. No stop signs on any side, just one of those simple whoever gets there first goes types. Visibility was good, no confusion, nothing difficult. Then, out of nowhere, Ranger Dave lost his shit. A car, some poor person in a Toyota Prius, pulled up just a little ahead of us and began to cross. Totally normal, totally right of way. But Ranger Dave floored it. Full throttle, Dodge Ram, 8 cylinders of rage. He absolutely smashed into the Prius in a full T-bone. He went ballistic, screaming, red-faced, neck veins bulging. A total monster. I hadn't even had time to put on my seatbelt. My head slammed into the windshield and split my forehead open. I was concussed and stunned, but still had enough presence of mind to check that he hadn't killed or seriously hurt the little old lady he'd just demolished. Somehow, she was alive, just shaken. I helped her out, gave her my information, told her I had literally just gotten in the truck moments before the crash. Then I called the police. And Ranger Dave, he took off. Just got back in his wrecked truck and drove away. After that, I kept seeing him around town like nothing ever happened. No apology, no explanation. Screw Ranger Dave. And that's it for tonight's collection of "Oh shit, this person is a psychopath" moment. If these stories left you disturbed or reminded you of someone in your own life, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more creepy, shocking, and unforgettable tales. Hit that like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos for more spine-chilling stories. And once more, if you're able to, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity truly mean so much. Thank you for watching, and remember, always trust your gut. Stay safe, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.